I would now like to, and I would like the panelists to stay up here on stage. And I'll now introduce Kanika Dewan, President of the Bahrain-based natural resources conglomerate Bramco Group, Chairperson and founder of Car Design Atelier, a design research and development company for mixed media finishes and sustainable design. And she's also a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader Class 2016. Welcome on stage.
I'd like you to look at this video for a minute. I guess most of you are thinking that what we just saw is a time-lapse depiction of everything that we've been talking about for the last couple of days, where we're headed on this planet. Well, you're partially right. It's where many, including Tesla and Boeing, want to go, where the US wants to give NASA around $20 billion to get to. But it's not where this planet is headed. It's a depiction, a supposed depiction, of Mars 40 billion years ago. It reminds me of a conversation that took place in the movie Interstellar between the professor and Cooper, the protagonist, for those of you who've not watched it. The professor says, "We must confront the reality that nothing in our solar system can help us." Cooper says, "Now you need to tell me what your plan is to save the world." Professor, "We're not meant to save the world. We're meant to leave it." So is that our plan? To invest on how to leave and rebuild another planet, which looks very much like where we are headed in any case? Is our plan to straddle between saving the world while big business and governments invest billions on how to leave, yet the UN continues to lobby on hope to save the Earth? To me, what we just saw looks like we've already been there. I mean, that we could have been on Mars and literally created what we're doing with Earth at the moment. It looks like the destruction that we're capable of. The good news is we're great builders. So we'll be able to build on any planet. We've been building the Earth, both laterally and vertically, efficiently using space per unit area. We've made amazing economic progress over the last 30 years, something that we pride ourselves on. We've made significant advancement in science and created disruption to give impetus to the fourth industrial revolution, which enables us to create smart cities. The once so-called developed world is developing so rapidly that India is shining. And in fact, in WEF India, a year before last, the opening line for India's growth was that 40 kilometers of highway are built per day, which means India's arrived, is shining, and has grown to the economic capabilities that the rest of the world should recognize. That's all we need. So let's imagine for a second, by 2020, the target for the SDGs, to make sure that 7 billion are actually working towards one of the SDGs being climate change. What if we're not there? We aren't where we're meant to be. Well, we'll be fine, because we can rebuild on any other planet as we've been doing at some point. So why are we here today? Shouldn't we be concentrating on our efforts to leave, as the professor said? Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. This was a statement made by Albert Schweitzer, French-German theologian, sometime at the turn of the 20th century. In my opinion, I would replace the word earth with any planet. While we think we're great innovators, the reality is that we're stuck in this vicious cycle of destruction. This has been proven right here on this planet. We've been growing and shrinking for eons. India used to be the sought-after country on the Silk Route. The Egyptian civilization was at the forefront of innovation as far as building, education, goods, and services. Now we witness a breakdown of sustainability, whether due to terrorism in Egypt or urban fragility in India. Delhi is now inhabitable with toxic levels of pollution. There's a reverse brain drain going on. Everyone wants to leave, including high achievers, leaders who have a comfortable life. Carbon emissions are rising, which results in rising temperatures, rising health pandemics, some of which you just heard in the competition, mosquitoes, chikungunya, etc. The country is laden with high levels of migration, which occur due to the fight for resources, access to which we ourselves had generated in abundance since the birth of our civilization some 7,000 years ago after the end of the Ice Age. We will create the same cycle of destruction on any planet. So was the past 2 days that we spent here just a gathering to make us feel good and enjoy Paris? Is there any point to all this at all when we're just going to leave? The point is that we have brought to life to the planet. We've brought incredible abundance of resources since the inception of the human civilization. But what we need to do now is regenerate that life. We need to move beyond the sustainable revolution that Al Gore often refers to. We need a spiritual transformation to change the way we look at our planet and not fall into the same vicious cycle that we've been repeating for generations. At the moment, the global defense budget seems to be larger than the finance allocations encouraged through the Paris Agreement. In 2016, the US defense budget rose to $622 billion, 40% of the world's defense budget. So you can imagine how big the global defense budget is. We need to move to allocating resources towards peace and saving the planet versus creating borders of destruction which further contribute towards the devastation of climate change. We just talk about Korea's testing of missiles. Our fear is a balance of power. But when does the news ever talk about the carbon footprint of these tests? Our governments pride themselves, and economic development is defined by defense budgets. In fact, India itself, on Indian Republic Day, most of what is showcased is the latest war aviation, machinery, and equipment. Apart from the devastation that was created by 9/11, you can only imagine what the carbon emissions of war and terrorism were. And one often forgets that when we spend money on defense, we need to think about peace and the impact that has on climate change. We need to return where we started. We lost our way somewhere, and we need to find it. And who's going to help? Sorry, can I just have a slide? I'm not sure where. So yes, I actually think he's one of the biggest, he's going to be the biggest help towards us reaching our Paris Agreement goals. Contrast inspires. Just as we had to reach this point to do something about something that philosophers had predicted eons ago, Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement would catalyze the individual who needs to bring about change versus political leaders who drive change. We need to mobilize everyone to start working towards individual impact. The entrepreneur, we need to recognize the entrepreneur who sits at home and provides the goods and services out of their house to reduce the carbon footprint, but cater to society, which is what infrastructure is about. Why aren't we teaching the individual about the carbon footprint? Just as nutrition the content of nutrition on every food product is listed on the back of packaging, why aren't we listing the carbon footprint of every single product that we produce? That's how you engage the individual. You don't have to worry about which leader signs the Paris Agreement, because what we need to do is mobilize the 7 billion people out there. We need a value-based framework. And we need to change the current gap if we're not to fall into that vicious cycle. And I have a little bit of a framework that we've developed to do this. Can I have the next slide, please? And because, we've lost our way somewhere, and how do we find it? Well, if we always remember the radar, and we jump to the island of utopia, the world that we're trying to create or go back to, what we need is, the first step is to renovate. We need to redefine infrastructure as a model that doesn't merely support facilities, goods, and services, but one that supports individuation and an interdependent web of global consciousness towards generating sustainably happy societies. The issue is, when you look at the Paris Agreement, you've got mitigate, adapt, and finance. We need to relook and renovate what that means. Renovate the meaning of financing. No, we need to, most of the people who are looking at the finance allocations are big banks who are looking at asset-based financing. What if this were to change? What if you don't look at revenue stream and you look at your high emissions of equipment and you actually get that as a negative on your revenue stream? Your revenue stream goes negative as a cash flow. So you don't actually get financed for big business emissions, but you actually get financed for how you contribute towards a sustainable economy which is sustainably happy. The Paris Agreement currently is non-invasive, but we need to adapt, and we need to adapt locally. For example, in a country like India, and in fact a lot of countries, how are you going to track the allocation of financial resources? What about corruption? Instead of rewarding big business, track it. So there needs to be an adaptation of that. We need to think out of the box and renovate. An audit body needs to be present. Human nature is not as enlightened as when it was given birth. We're happy with statistics and numbers. We say that India is doing well and only contributes to 6% of carbon emission problems. Yet New Delhi is suffocating in a cocoon of smog. However, the government is more concerned about the highways they build per day. The next part is we need to look at accountability. An example, myself. We were working on the Delhi International Airport project, an extension of it, just recently. And right after Prime Minister Modi had signed on with the Paris Agreement, there were a lot of changes that took place in the city. What they did was they stopped construction to see what happens when you stop construction for a couple of days. Is there an improvement in the pollution levels? Well, that was a noble idea. It's treating the symptom, not the root, but it was a step towards the right direction. But what happened? We work with PPPs, so the airport is a public-private partnership. What did the private entity tell us to do? When the stoppage went over a week, there was a decline in revenue. So I was called in for a meeting, and I won't name names, but with the private entity, and I was told, you're going beyond the specified deadline. And we said, yes, that's right, because there's a stoppage of work all around the city. They said, well, you need to start working at night. No one's going to know because there's no security, and we'll shut the cameras off. That's where we need to track accountability. That's where we feel there needs to be a hybrid of what's going on with what happened with Kyoto and what's happening with the Paris Agreement. The other part is definition. We need to redefine what sectors of society are important. Rather than looking at vote banks of the youth, we need to also go back. If we want to go back to where we returned, we need to go back to look at the signs. We need to look at the elderly population that's often missed out. They're giving us the signs. For example, in India, the hospitals are full with elderly population suffering from lung problems currently. I just came from there, and the hospitals were completely full. Every doctor was talking about this. That's a sign. We're not running out of time, we're just not listening. That's what we need to focus on. We need to redefine who's important. if we really want to reach the entire population. We then come to asset-based financing, which is the A of our radar. Asset-based financing and asset-based thinking. What we're doing about that, for example, is promote entrepreneurship to think on how we can innovate new models. For example, we're working on a model of sustainable happiness by creating villages, one in a developing world and one in the developed world, to work on the circular economy, but also look at every aspect of sustainability where each individual is contributing to the village. In essence, everything from the mobile house to the toilet that you're using is creating energy in a sustainable fashion. These are the type of projects that we need to see, where businesses are willing to take the risk. On the profit side of the business, we're looking at redesigning highways, where you're looking at filtration systems, so not just using barriers, sound barriers, just to eliminate sound, but also to trap pollution and carbon emissions. This is the type of innovation we need to look at when we're looking at asset-based financing and asset-based thinking. Finally, we need to renovate. We need to also look at our reward system. The press often rewards a soundbite. The press will often reward big business on one hand, where big business will end up contributing to sustainability, but on the other hand, it'll be a zero-sum game. Just like I told you at the airport, there's an entire budget set aside for solar cities, for solar panels, and rainwater harvesting. But on the other hand, when you're looking at carbon emissions from the machinery and equipment used, there are no strategies to prevent that. They want to work at the night to avoid measures that the government are taking, and there isn't really an internal commitment towards sustainability or towards saving the planet. It's really looking at the bottom line. It's revenue-based. So how do we get there? We need to look at individual reward systems. We need to cater to individuals who often wouldn't be recognized. Have we ever spoken to individuals who've survived the tsunami? We haven't. You don't really see them on the news or in Hollywood. At the end of the day, we realize that climate change is blind to borders. It is blind to politics and is blind to power. We will be well on our way to open our eyes and rage against the dying of the light. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Kanika Dewan for adding spirituality to our rationality and to the equation. And thank you to this fantastic panel for adding the civil society to the equation of business, government, and finance. Thank you very much. And before we end, I'll give the final word to Stephanie to say a goodbye. And thank you to Stephanie for putting such a fantastic event together.
Thank you, Kanika, to join us this evening. Thank you for your speech. It was amazing. Thank you for this. Je voudrais tous vous remercier une nouvelle fois et vous inviter à partager un verre de clôture d'événement, un verre de champagne qui vous attend dehors. Je voudrais aussi remercier l'ensemble de mon équipe qui est présente, je pense, ici et dehors et qui vous accueille. Remercier l'ensemble de l'équipe commerciale, marketing et technique qui a fait un travail de mercenaires, de résilients, parce que passer d'un événement type salon à un événement de networking comme celui-ci avec tout ce contenu, ça a aussi nécessité que nous, en interne, nous changions notre manière de travailler, de penser. Merci à tous et je vous souhaite une excellente fin de semaine et j'espère vous revoir très bientôt sur nos événements. À bientôt.